On September 12, 1944, Major Robert Cowboy Stewart piloted his F6F Hellcat, streaking over the Palau Islands at 8,000 feet as an automatic camera clicked steadily away. His orders were simple: snap photos of the northern airfield, then return to the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. Intelligence had assured him the airfield was abandoned, likely damaged and inoperable from previous bombings. But they didn't know the Japanese were merely in hiding, repositioning for an attack. When Stewart glanced down, a chill ran through his body. The airfield below was packed with Japanese warplanes. Nakajima G-4M Betty bombers and dozens of fighter jets lined up wing to wing. Fuel drums were stacked high, and ground crew swarmed every aircraft. This place was no ghost town. They were prepping for a massive strike. Stewart quickly counted at least 40 fully fueled, armed warplanes, and he knew exactly what they were waiting for. In 3 days, 28,000 U.S. Marines would storm the beaches of Palau in one of the Pacific War's largest amphibious assaults, with the invasion fleet already en route. Those 40 Japanese planes were poised to annihilate them before they even reached the shore. Stewart had drilled the rules into his head: spot enemy targets, report coordinates, return to base, and let command decide the response. Recon pilots were meant to observe and report, not engage, especially alone, against an entire airfield ringed with anti-aircraft guns. But Stewart also knew military bureaucracy. By the time he landed, filed his report, and command assembled a strike force, hours, even a full day would pass. The Japanese would scatter their planes into bunkers, or worse, launch an immediate attack on the fleet. The Marines set to hit the beaches in 3 days had no time for red tape. They needed those planes destroyed now, not tomorrow. Robert Stewart was no reckless pilot. At 28, he'd flown 63 combat missions, survived dogfights with Zero fighters, struck fortified positions under heavy fire, and even landed his plane on a carrier during a storm that grounded every other pilot. He knew the line between courage and suicide, and what he was about to do teetered right on its edge. Quick interact. Before we pick up the story, we're curious. Where are you watching from? And how much do you know about the Battle of Palau? Drop a comment below if you've ever heard of Cowboy Stewart's daring raid. Because let's be clear, Robert Stewart was far from reckless. If he attacked, every anti-aircraft gun on Palau would lock onto him. He'd be alone, no wingman to suppress ground fire or cover his escape. The Hellcat could take a beating, but a single lucky bullet to the engine or cockpit would send him crashing into the jungle, with no hope of rescue. If he didn't attack, those 40 planes would launch in waves, striking the invasion fleet. Japanese pilots would strafe landing craft, bomb transport ships, and turn the beaches into a slaughterhouse. Hundreds of Marines would die before they even established a beachhead. Stewart had seen the horror of Marines landing under air attack. He'd flown close air support at Tarawa, watching Japanese warplanes wreak havoc on the first wave of landings, powerless to stop bombers from targeting packed, immobile, defenseless landing craft. He made his decision in less than 30 seconds. He slammed the throttle forward and dove the Hellcat toward the ground. The altimeter plummeted as the fighter streaked toward the jungle canopy. His plan was simple: a fast, low-level run, hit the fuel drums first, and escape before anti-aircraft gunners could lock on. At 2,000 feet, he leveled the plane, pushed the throttle to the max, and the Hellcat accelerated to nearly 400 miles per hour, its engine roaring at full power. He dropped to just 50 feet above the treetops, the jungle blurring beneath him, until the airfield burst into view through the trees. Japanese ground crew stared up in confusion as the Hellcat screamed past. Some froze in place, others scrambled for cover. None made it to their anti-aircraft positions in time. Stewart locked onto a row of fighters on the northern side, squeezed the trigger, and 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns erupted in fire, their roar drowning out the engine. Tracer rounds streaked across the tarmac, piercing the thin aluminum fuselages of the Zero fighters. The planes shuddered under the assault, fuel gushing from ruptured tanks. Stewart adjusted his aim slightly and fired at a cluster of fuel drums stacked between two bombers. The drums disintegrated under the .50 caliber fire, and aviation fuel exploded in a massive fireball, swallowing both planes whole. The blast was bigger than Stewart could have imagined. Flames shot 50 feet into the air, and the shockwave jolted the Hellcat as he yanked the yoke back. Behind him, the fire spread at a terrifying pace. The first burning Zero ignited the plane parked next to it, the flames rippling outward in a chain reaction, each explosion feeding the next. In seconds, half the fighters in the northern row were engulfed. Japanese ground crew fled in all directions, abandoning any attempt to save the planes. Anti-aircraft gunners finally took their positions and opened fire, but Stewart was already climbing away. He dodged and weaved as tracer rounds zipped past the cockpit, feeling the plane jolt as 20-millimeter cannon fire tore through the tail. Warning lights flashed on the instrument panel, but the engine still roared strong. He banked hard right, climbed higher, and circled back, and the destruction below exceeded all expectations. Nearly 20 planes were ablaze, flames spreading across the tarmac like a river of fire, thick black smoke billowing into the sky for miles to see. But on the southern end of the airfield, at least 20 more planes remained intact. Stewart checked his ammo, half gone, with only about 17 seconds of firing time left. Anti-aircraft gunners were now fully alert, tracking him as he circled. Diving again would be a death sentence. Yet he rolled the plane over and dove once more. This time, anti-aircraft fire erupted all around him immediately, tracers swarming like angry hornets. He zigzagged hard, never flying straight long enough for the gunners to get a precise aim. The Hellcat shuddered under more hits, metal tearing somewhere in the fuselage. Stewart attacked from multiple angles, locking onto the bombers on the southern end and raking them with his remaining ammo. Control surfaces were shredded, fuel tanks punctured. His fire hit a fuel truck, and the explosion was so powerful it flipped a nearby bomber on its back. An instant secondary blast followed, as burning fuel from the truck spread to stacked ammo crates, triggering a series of rapid explosions. The bomber's own ordnance detonated, tearing it apart from the inside. In an instant, the southern planes were burning too, the flames just as fierce as the north. Stewart's machine guns fell silent. He was out of ammo. As he pulled the plane upward, the Hellcat felt sluggish, its damaged control surfaces making it hard to maneuver. More warning lights blazed, and a thin trail of smoke trailed from the fuselage, a leak somewhere. But the airfield below was a complete inferno. Every plane, every fuel drum, every building was engulfed in flames. A pillar of smoke rose thousands of feet into the sky, a tombstone marking the site. Stewart piloted the damaged Hellcat toward the ocean, struggling to stay on course. The plane's hydraulic system was dead, making the controls heavy and unresponsive. Oil pressure was dropping fast, and he wasn't sure if the landing gear would deploy, but at the very least, the engine still ran. The trip back was longer than the attack itself, and as the adrenaline faded, he finally processed what he'd just done. He defied direct orders, choosing to attack an entire airfield alone, instead of taking photos and returning as commanded. A court-martial was a real possibility, and he'd likely be chewed out by every officer from his squadron leader to the admiral. But none of the Navy's punishment could be worse than watching those 40 planes slaughter hundreds of Marines. The USS Hornet appeared on the horizon, and Stewart radioed the tower. Plane damaged, landing gear status unknown, requesting priority landing. The carrier turned into the wind, clearing the deck. The landing gear deployed, but one wheel failed to lock. He landed at high speed, catching the second arresting wire, and the damaged Hellcat slammed onto the deck so hard it bent metal. Deck crew swarmed the plane immediately, stunned by the damage. The tail was shredded, the fuselage pocked with a dozen bullet holes, and the paint was charred black from flying through the explosions. Stewart climbed out of the cockpit to face a group of officers. The Air Department chief demanded to know why he'd returned from a recon mission with battle damage. The squadron commander wanted an explanation for breaking radio silence. Intelligence officers begged to know what had happened on Palau. Stewart's report was simple. The airfield wasn't abandoned. It was packed with planes ready to attack the invasion fleet, and he'd destroyed every last one of them. 40 planes, from spotting the enemy to finishing the attack and heading back, in just 8 minutes. The officers stared at him in disbelief. Intelligence made him repeat the number. 1 pilot, 1 plane, 40 enemy aircraft destroyed. It seemed impossible, but the recon photos confirmed it. The next day, Palau's northern airfield was completely destroyed. Not a single plane left operational. Aerial photos showed the charred wreckage of 40 Japanese warplanes scattered across the blackened tarmac. Fuel depots reduced to craters, buildings to rubble. Intelligence revised its assessment of Japanese air power on Palau immediately. The next day, U.S. Marines landed on the beaches with total air superiority. The Japanese air threat had been eliminated by a single pilot who'd refused to follow orders. The Navy awarded Stewart the Navy Cross, the second highest honor for combat bravery, with a citation praising his extraordinary heroism and aggressive fighting spirit in attacking a superior enemy force alone. His decision to take initiative, it read, had directly saved the lives of American service members. But the Battle of Palau would still be brutal. On September 15, 1944, the Marines landed and were immediately thrown into one of the fiercest fights of the Pacific War. Japanese forces had fortified the island's coral ridges and caves, turning every position into a deadly bunker. The battle raged for more than 2 months, killing nearly 2,000 Americans. But the death toll would have been far higher without Stewart's attack. Those 40 Japanese planes were meant to strike during the most vulnerable hours of the invasion, when Marines were packed onto landing craft and transport ships with nowhere to hide and no way to maneuver. Air attacks during amphibious assaults are devastating, and military historians later estimated that Stewart's solo raid likely saved 500 to 1,000 Marine lives on the first day alone. In 8 minutes of fighting, he'd accomplished what would have required an entire bomber squadron, and he'd struck at the critical moment, just before the Japanese could scatter their planes. After the war, Stewart returned to California and lived a quiet life, rarely speaking of his experience in Palau. His children grew up knowing their father had served in the Pacific, but they wouldn't learn the full story for decades. The Navy Cross sat in a drawer, never hung on a wall. Friends who knew him said he hated the attention and praise, and when asked about the raid, he'd brush it off with the same line. "I saw planes that needed destroying, so I destroyed them. Any pilot would have done the same." But not every pilot would have. Most would have followed orders, radioed the situation, and let command handle it through the proper channels. A bureaucratic approach that would have given the Japanese enough time to scatter or launch their planes. What made the difference was Stewart's willingness to defy orders and trust his own judgment. Outside military aviation circles, his story was largely forgotten for decades, until historians rediscovered his mission reports. Researchers cross-referenced his Navy Cross citation with Japanese records and aerial photos, and only then did they realize the full magnitude of his achievement. 1 man, 1 plane, 40 enemy aircraft destroyed in 8 minutes, saving thousands of lives. This raid showcased a lesson military strategists still study today: the value of tactical initiative. Stewart couldn't be certain his decision was correct. He guessed at the Japanese plan, bet his life that his assessment of the threat was accurate, and risked everything to pull off the attack. Every logical factor urged caution. Follow orders, report back, let superiors decide. But Stewart understood that sometimes the person on the ground, in the air, with a first-hand view of the situation, has a better judgment than a commander staring at a map miles away. His willingness to trust his assessment, even when it meant defying direct orders, embodied the principle of commander's intent. The Navy hadn't ordered him to attack the airfield, but they'd sent him to protect the invasion force. He understood the purpose behind his mission, and he adapted when the situation demanded it. The Navy's decision to award him the Navy Cross instead of court-martialing him was an official recognition of this truth. Strict obedience would have led to disaster, and Stewart's defiance was, in fact, the highest form of following the intent, not just the letter, of the order. Modern fighter pilots study Stewart's raid in tactical training courses, not just for the flying skills it displayed, but for the decision-making under pressure. The military teaches that sometimes strict obedience means missing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The raid also demonstrated perfect target prioritization. Stewart didn't waste ammo trying to destroy 40 planes one by one. Instead, he identified the critical weak point, the fuel drums, and exploited it. A single bullet in the right place is worth 1,000 in the wrong one. His fast, low-level runs from multiple angles minimized the time he spent exposed to anti-aircraft fire, showing a tactical maturity far beyond just aiming and shooting. He analyzed the defenses, planned his attack routes, and kept fighting even when his plane was damaged. And crucially, he knew when to stop. Once he was out of ammo, he didn't linger to assess the damage or hunt for more targets. He fled immediately. The mission was done, and staying longer would have only meant unnecessary risk. Every one of these decisions was made in a matter of seconds, under heavy fire, with no time for careful deliberation. Stewart's training and experience let him make the right call at every turn in an instant. Robert "Cowboy" Stewart died in 2005 at the age of 89. His family finally shared his story with the world, and military historians rushed to document the details before they were lost to time. Mission reports, recon photos, and his Navy Cross citation all confirm this almost unbelievable fact. In the end, Stewart's attack on Palau was one of the most successful solo raids in naval aviation history. Few pilots in World War II destroyed so many enemy aircraft in a single mission, alone, in a single plane. His 8 minutes of fighting stopped a devastating air attack on the Palau invasion. The Marines who stormed those beaches never knew a Navy pilot had defied orders to save their lives. They fought through hell on that coral island, clashing with Japanese defenders in fortified positions. Every inch of land, a battlefield. But at the very least, they didn't face 40 warplanes strafing them as they tried to reach the shore. Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is refuse to follow orders, not out of cowardice or rebellion, but because the situation demands action, and strict adherence to protocol would stand in the way. Stewart knew this instinctively. When faced with a choice between doing what he was told and doing what was right, he chose the mission over the order. His legacy lives on in every tactical training course that teaches initiative over obedience, adaptability over rigidity, trust in the judgment of the person on the scene. The military learned from Stewart and pilots like him that sometimes the best course of action is the one no one ordered you to take. Next time you're faced with a situation where following the rules feels wrong, where rigid protocol clashes with obvious necessity, think of Cowboy Stewart circling the Palau airfield all those years ago. He knew what had to be done. He knew the cost if he failed, but he did it anyway, because the alternative was far worse. If this story moved you like it moved us, take a second to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Subscribe to the channel to stay connected with these untold pieces of history. Every story matters. Every story deserves to be remembered. We'd love to hear from you too. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Our community stretches from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history buffs, and you're a special part of it. Thanks for watching, And thanks for keeping these stories alive.